Welcome to the Conform Object add-on, which wraps objects onto another object's surface in one action. I'm going to take you through how to use the add-on, and documentation is also linked in the description. Do get in touch if you have any questions. The add-on is installed like a regular add-on in Blender. Go to Edit Preferences, select the Add-ons tab if it isn't already, and click the Install button. Select the zip file you downloaded and then click Install Add-on. Then the add-on should appear in the list of all the other add-ons. Make sure the checkbox is checked next to it. Let's get started. So here we have a basic object that I'm going to conform to a sphere surface. The object is from a KitOps library, but we'll just be treating it as we would any other object. Also note that the object is ideally one that has a fairly straightforward setup. It doesn't have any child objects or any Boolean modifiers that are dependent on other objects. The object is also a good demonstrator of how to use some of the add-on's parameters. So with the base of the object pointing directly towards the sphere's surface, which is important, all you should need to do is click on the object, which we'll call the source object, and then press Shift, and then click on the target object last. Then right-click to get the context menu in Blender and go down to the Conform Object tab. Select Conform Object, and voila! The object should be wrapped to the surface of the target object. So I'll now talk about how the add-on works and some of the challenges you might encounter, as this was what we call the sunny day scenario. There are certain other scenarios where the add-on might perform less well, and I've put some parameters in to help. The add-on actually has two modes. The first mode is called Grid Mode, and the second is called Shrinkwrap Mode. Grid Mode is the default and works by automatically creating a hidden grid object that is used to map to the surface. In the parameters which appear in the bottom left, when the operation is being done, you can unhide the grid, which is parented to the source object. The add-on works like this. First, the grid is created and placed directly behind the source object. Then, the source object has a surface deform modifier added to it and associated with the grid. Then, a Shrinkwrap modifier is used to wrap the grid to the target object. Because of the surface deform modifier, when the grid is deformed, the source object is deformed along with it as well. You can change some of the parameters of the grid, such as its resolution, which can sometimes help the grid bind more smoothly to complex surfaces. I tend to leave it as is in most scenarios. Shrinkwrap mode is an alternative approach which uses a shrink-wrap modifier on the source object to wrap it to a target object. It uses a weighted vertex group to make the wrap effect greater at the bottom of the source object than it is on the top. More on that in a moment. Although a simpler setup, I find this mode sometimes produces a less desirable result, as the object is kind of being sucked onto the surface. However, it may be good in some other cases. Let's go back to grid mode for now and discuss some of the cases you might encounter. First, let's have a closer look at this object. You'll notice that applying the conform operation to the whole of this object is not ideal, as the threads are also distorted, and in reality you would not be able to fit a bolt around it. To deal with this, we can adjust the gradient effect setting, which is already checked. This automatically sets a vertex group weighting from the base of the source object up to the top, and the weights get less and less towards the top of the object. We can lower the effect of this by changing the end point parameter. This controls where on the object the effect will terminate. By default, it is set to 1 or the top of the object. However, by lowering the value, we can also lower where the effect ends. We could also increase the value beyond 1 if we like. Let's lower this value so the threading is no longer affected. Another thing to talk about is bad deformations you might see and how we might deal with them. If we delete the source object, add a basic cube and subdivide it. The add-on will work best on objects with more vertices. So when we conform this object to the surface, you'll notice there may be some imperfections in the deformation. We can smooth out some of the upper imperfections with a gradient effect, but let's also look at the target object. There may not be enough geometry on the source object for it to conform to. Increasing the geometry on the target object, perhaps with a subdivision surface modifier, can help the source object better conform to the surface. There's another hopefully useful feature I've included, and that's how we can blend the surface normals of the source object with the target object. Here I have a simple pointy object I modelled, and I want to put horns on the surface of the target object. Conform the object as per usual, but this time enable blend normals. This will automatically transfer the normals on the surface of the target object to the source object, creating a more blended effect at render time. Adjusting the separate endpoint parameter for this feature also affects where on the base object the influence is terminated. If you want to undo the operation, select the source object, right-click and select Undo Conform Object. This will remove all relevant modifiers created by the add-on and remove the grid object. You might also want to apply the conform operation to the object, which you can do with the option Apply Conform Object. This will apply all the relevant modifiers instead, leaving you with the altered object that you can then edit. If trying to use the conform object as a Boolean cutter on the target object, I would recommend you use the Apply Conform Object operation first, which will apply all the modifiers. Otherwise, you'll get Blender into a loop where it is trying to use the object to cut, but then the source object itself is trying to deform to the cut shape. Another feature I've added is the toggle surface snapping feature. In order to get the object to point directly towards the target object, this automatically configures Blender's snap mode for aligning an object to the surface of another when you move it. Selecting the option again disables the mode. Some gotchas. In grid mode, if you edit the base object, the deformation gets disabled. This is because the surface deformation modifier loses its binding. You can fix this by simply performing the conform object operation again, which will replace the surface deformation modifier with a new one. Also in grid mode, if you copy an object, the copied object will not have the conform applied. This is because the copied object would have been pointing to the old grid object. Again, just reapply the conform object operation on this copied object and you should be good to go. There are some other features and edge cases to read about in the documentation, so check there and do not hesitate to contact me via the links in the description if you have any questions. Thanks for listening.